Okay, so now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Fiona Dunbar. Fiona has been collaborating with Macmillan now for quite a number of years. I can't remember how many, Fiona, but I think it's been probably at least 8 years or so.
I
And
think at
it's
least, yeah.
I think so, no? And Fiona has a lot of experience in ELT. She has been in ELT teaching, training, managing, I think for some 25 years or so. I'll leave that open. She is currently the director of a language school in Malaga called Ellie. She is also a team leader for the Cambridge Young Learner exams. And she has a special interest in motivation, in personalization, in creativity, and also learner development and their implication for second language acquisition, for learning English in the classroom. And her talk today, which is called "Can I Have Some More Please?", will focus on how to maximize students' learning in and out of the classroom. And it will be relevant for young learners, for teens, and for adults. So welcome, Fiona.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you. Lovely to be here again. So thank you for having me. As you said, my talk this morning is called "Can I Have Some More, Please?" And basically, as Louise has mentioned, I've been teaching and training and managing for many years now, mainly in Andalusia, but also in other places. And over the years, I've come to consider a number of things about my students, about my classes, and things that maybe we can do to try to maximize the students' time and efforts, and of course our time and efforts, inside and outside of the classroom. So, first of all, as Louise mentioned, many of you are probably in a similar position to me, where I have spent many years teaching mainly face-to-face. This is a picture of my usual classroom here. And I have had some experience of teaching online previously also, but I've now found myself in a position where quite suddenly I've been put into a completely different classroom. And so now I'm teaching mainly online, teaching the same students and the same classes that I have been, but we have transferred our classroom from face-to-face to online. Now, as you know, Macmillan always offer excellent Teachers' Days, and for the last few years they have been doing the online Teachers' Days. I've participated in them before. This is not new for us to be doing online training. But when we first talked about my contribution to today's session, I was teaching in my classroom, and I had no idea that this was going to be the situation. And so when obviously then we ended up being at home, I sort of wondered what to do, and I thought, really, should I change the session? Should I be considering things which are only relevant for online teaching? Should I consider things, carry on with things which are only relevant for face-to-face teaching? But in fact, the main thing that I think is important is a good teacher is a good teacher anywhere. Now, I don't doubt that everybody there who's spending their morning listening to this training session is an excellent teacher. And I think it's really important for us to remember that at the moment, that it doesn't really matter where we are. It doesn't really matter what tools we have. Good teaching is good teaching regardless of the context. So that's where we're coming from today. So we're going to start off with a have your say. As Louise mentioned, we want you to participate in the session. I want to hear everybody's opinions. I want to hear what's happening out there. I want you to participate as you would if we were in a face-to-face session. So my question for you is, how are your students feeling at the moment? How are you feeling? And if you open up the box on your screen, then you can write in and tell us how everybody's feeling at the moment.
Okay, so yes, Fiona, we'll give the participants, the viewers, a couple of seconds to reply to that. You don't need to write full sentences, just short answers. And meanwhile, while we're waiting for the responses, actually, I wanted to ask you, Fiona, how are you feeling? And how are your students feeling at the moment?
Well, what I think is it would be interesting to go on to Emma's session where she's talking about mindfulness,
Yes,
which comes up after this one. And I'm very aware of the fact that my feelings are changing a lot at the moment. My students are in a similar position. I've been talking to them and asking them a lot. I've got students from 3 years old through teenagers up to
okay.
adults. I've got all ranges of students, and I do make a point of asking them how they feel. And I think the main thing that comes through at the moment is possibly feeling a bit stressed. Many people
Yes,
are feeling stressed about the situation, about the world that we're in, but also about their own personal context. That, we're trying to work, we're trying to learn. Many people are trying to manage families,
exactly.
and I think
There's a lot of
there's a feeling of stress there, and maybe a bit overwhelmed.
Absolutely. Well, that's actually what's coming through on the have your say on the chat. The majority of people seem to be saying overwhelmed. That adjective
Yeah.
is coming up quite often. Stressed and confused, challenged, exhausted, because there's this multitasking going on, which I think we're all experiencing. But as a teacher, combining classes with home life, if you have children and especially young children, it's more than challenging, isn't it? And let's see, as regards, so that's how people are feeling, and then in relation to how students are feeling, well, people are giving different responses. They're feeling overwhelmed. One person, Joanna, thank you, Joanna. She's saying, my students are feeling quite bored and wish they were back
Mhm.
to normal life. I think many people would probably agree with that. And students, another person is saying, students are feeling stressed, fed up, and bored, and the teacher is feeling overwhelmed and overworked. Of course, that's another issue. Being working online, it's more difficult, isn't it, to set boundaries and to keep and maintain routines and separate, I suppose, private from professional um, during the day. Another person saying the students are feeling stressed. So, yes. And some people are suffering from backaches. I understand
Yeah,
them perfectly.
absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for your responses. I think we're all probably on the same page. So back to you, Fiona.
Yeah, it very much looks like people are in a similar position. I saw somebody there said that people feel a bit frazzled. And, what was coming through there a lot was overwhelmed, a bit stressed, a bit discouraged, tired, bored. These are not very positive adjectives to describe feelings at the moment. So what I did want to make clear is that when I'm talking here about can I have some more please, and I'm talking about trying to get more out of our students, then what I don't mean is to create more work for you, for them. I think we always have plenty of work to do, and this is certainly not the time to be trying to create more work and stress for anybody. So what we are looking at is trying to maximize the opportunities that we have, make the most of the time and the effort that we and our students are putting into our classes, and trying to exploit those opportunities. So, as I said, there's no doubt that our students are learning, but are they capable of more? Are we settling for less? We often talk about young learners, particularly for learning, and there's a kind of feeling that maybe after that, people slow down on their ability to acquire language quickly. You may well be aware of the critical period hypothesis, which talks about the idea that young children are able to acquire language, and that beyond a certain age, their ability can't learn languages. Now, of course, those types of hypotheses are widely disputed. They're not always accepted by everybody, but I think there is clearly a relevance in terms of input. So just to have a quick mention first of some of the ideas behind what we're talking about today. I don't want to go into too much theory, but this is on the handout, which, as Louise mentioned, you'll get through the email after the session. Things I've been thinking about over the years include Stephen Krashen's hypothesis of I+1, which talks about comprehensible input. It's fascinating to have a look into that if you're not aware of it. Scott Thornbury also discusses emergent language, which talks about the language which comes up during language learning and is not necessarily part of the course as such. And then we have Adrian Underhill and Jim Scrivener's ideas behind demand high, which is talking about ways in which we can demand more of our students, but they are, all, again, very clear that demand high does not mean demand difficult. So we need to be careful to remember that. Now, I've got another chance for you to participate here. It's a quick poll, and I just want you to tell me at the moment, how many hours of class are your students doing per week? Now, of course, this will vary, possibly from class to class, but just to have an idea, how many hours per week are your students doing online at the moment? Or I don't think anybody's teaching face-to-face, but just to get an idea there.
Okay, so there are 4 options. We've got 5 or more hours, 3 or 4 hours, 1 or 2 hours, or no live hours. And we'll just wait a couple of seconds for the results to come in, because as people add their response. Fiona, how many hours of class are you doing per week?
So we're doing the same number of live online hours as we were doing face-to-face in the language school. So okay. I have my very young learners do less than 2 hours. My young learners do 2 hours per week, and my teens and adults do 3 hours per week.
Okay, so you've maintained the timetable basically.
Exactly, I'm there in the middle.
Okay. Okay, so let's have a look at the results. So it seems like the majority at the moment are saying 3 or 4 hours. It's around the 40%. And next 1 or 2 hours at about 33%. And there is approximately just over 20% who are saying no live hours, and 10% 5 or more hours. So the majority is in the 3 or 4 hour range. Okay, over to you, Fiona.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. So it looks like most people are in a similar position to myself there, that we're looking at kind of 1, 2, 3 or 4 hours per week. But I think it is interesting that 20% here are saying no live hours. So presumably those students and those teachers are are trying to deal with language learning and language teaching with no face-to-face interaction. And when I say face-to-face, I'm including here live interaction like we're having now. Okay. So, as I said, we're talking about input, and although I do believe that the idea of age is not necessarily a barrier as such, I think it's true that a lot of input is necessary for good language teaching. So I'm just going to read a short paragraph here, and if you have a pen or pencil and a paper, then feel free to listen and to jot down any numbers that you hear. Okay? There's not a test on it, so don't worry if you don't. But just listen and jot down any numbers. Okay, so language learning, whether it occurs in a natural or an instructed context, is a slow and laborious process. Children acquiring their first language take between 2 and 5 years to achieve full grammatical competence, during which time they're exposed to massive amounts of input. We estimate that children learning their native language are exposed to 17,000 hours of input by age 4. Studying 1 hour per week in a classroom, it would take 425 years to match the input of children learning their native language. Okay, now, I don't know whether you had a chance to write down those numbers, but here we are. And I think this is a text which I saw. I did a course a while ago, an excellent course run by Trinity, an online course. And I think what was fascinating for me was this idea that if students are doing 1 hour a week, it would take 425 hours to reach the same amount of input as a 4-year-old child would have in their own L1 context. Now, I think we all know that language academies or schools or Escuela Oficial, wherever we are, the input is going to be less than if you're in a kind of immersion context. But the difference there really was quite shocking. And so I think we need to bear that in mind and to know that we've got to make the absolute most of the time in the class and outside of the class to make sure that our students are getting good use of those hours. And okay, they're not going to get 425 years of teaching, but to make sure that they're getting as much as they can and as quickly as they can. So the basic concept here, we're talking about input in the classroom and outside of the classroom. We're trying to maximize the students' exposure, which will then lead them to have a better output of language. Now, we're not just talking about general input, about general exposure. It needs to be varied, meaningful, as well as maximum. Okay, and these are some of the things we're going to look at then this morning. We want to be maximizing the L2 exposure inside the classroom, creating a language-rich classroom environment, which again is one of the terms that we discussed on the course that I did before, and to maximize opportunities for students to receive input outside the classroom. So in terms of inside the classroom, some of the things we need to think about, we need variety of content, but also variety of source and variety of interaction. Now, as I said, a good teacher is a good teacher, and I think we need to consider what things we normally do in the face-to-face classroom that we can replicate as best as possible through our online classes, or if we don't have any live online hours, then through the different media that we're sending to our students. Maybe you're using Google Classroom or using a Moodle of some sort, and we need some variety on the input that the students are getting there. So as much as possible, trying to get input from pairs, doing pair work, doing group work, doing individual work as we would in the classroom. And also taking those opportunities for real communication. Now those seem much easier to deal with when we're in a face-to-face classroom because, of course, our students come in and we talk about the weather, we talk about how the day's been, we talk about things, but also I think we can take those opportunities in the online class to talk about for example, the technology that they're using. Many of my students are saying, I can't get my audio to work, or my microphone's not working. I'm going to change computer. And I think picking up on those moments, maximising the opportunity to use English when talking about those things is an incredible opportunity not to be missed there. Now, the other things I've got here, we're talking about teacher talking time. As a general rule, we tend to say that teacher talking time should be reduced in the classroom. We tend to say that the teacher shouldn't talk so much. But I have to say, when we're talking about very young learners particularly, but also young learners, I don't agree. I think teacher talking time is absolutely essential. I think the more talking you can do to the students, the better. So in my infants classes, for example, I have a kind of running commentary that keeps going when I'm getting things ready, when I'm talking about things. So I'm saying, okay, here we are, we're getting Dex. He's coming to join us today. He's going to sing the song. And all of that language, it's not talking about language that they're going to immediately understand and go away and use, but the exposure has to be useful. The other things here that we often talk about in terms of young learners, but I think are also important for older age groups, are routines and fast finishers. So, for example, with fast finishers, when I'm in my classroom, I have a box for each level and for each group that I have, and it has some things in it that the students can go and do when they finish the activity we're working on in the classroom. So we're doing an exercise in our book, or we're doing a task of some sort. When the students finish, they go to the box and they take something they want to work with. Some of the things that are in there are flashcards, information gaps, puzzles, etc. It can be anything. Now here at the bottom I've got exam practice. That's relevant for this time of year, of course. And I think the important thing here is that also your adult students can have a box where they can go and access things to do when they finish the activity we're working on in the class. So you can have in there word cards, things for them to revise vocabulary. You can have exam practice tasks. You can have some questions for them to ask another student who's also finished. Now, of course, in my online classroom, I don't have these boxes, but what I do is make sure that these things are available to the students at the same time. So you can do that through having internet. If they're already in your classroom, you can direct them to another internet page where they can do a game or a puzzle or something while they're waiting for the other students to finish. Depending on the platform you're using, you may also be able to send them things to print off or send them things to look at on their screen. So I think it's just using those moments which seem at the time minimal. We're talking about 1 or 2 minutes. But I think, we've got to, those 1 or 2 minutes add up over the year. And if we're trying to get towards 425 years of language exposure, then those minutes count for sure. Also, in terms of routines, beginning the lesson, again, it's something we tend to do with young learners, that we have a starting routine, but the same with teens and adults. Make sure that they start the class by talking about something, by interacting, give them something to look at when they first arrive. We'll talk about that in a moment when we look at the language-rich classroom. So what routines do you use to start and end your lessons? I'd like to hear from you here. Louise, if you...
Yes. Okay, so the next have you say is, what routines do you use to start and end your lessons? So we'll give you, again, a couple of seconds in order to reply to that. Short answers are fine. And in the meantime, well, Fiona, do you have any particular favorite routines for starting and ending your lessons?
I do. I have to say, with almost every single age group, and every single level, we always start with some kind of interaction, some kind of usually peer work. If it's a small group, then we do it open class, but we talk about, depends on the level, of course, and the context, but we talk about how you're feeling, how your weekend has been, what you've done today, what your plans are, those kind of things. I think
Great.
some natural interaction.
Absolutely. Okay. And I think a lot of people here are saying similar things as well. For young learners, Lucy says they write the date and weather on the board. They take turns to do that at the beginning of each class. Another person is saying that they talk about what they've been doing, revising some of the vocabulary used in the previous lesson. Perhaps they also talk about what they've been doing in the class at the end of the class. Greetings at the beginning, greetings to students, and vice versa. Vicky uses songs and games. Another person says warm-up activities. And another person correcting homework, and a lovely response from somebody who says, they say the best thing about your day today. So that's nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that's a lovely way to start. What's the best thing that's happened to you? What's the best thing about your day so far? And I find I often ask my students that question, and of course they start off, particularly at the moment where they're feeling, as we said, a bit bored, a bit stressed. They start off, they say, nothing, it's been boring, I haven't done anything. But actually, when you push them, there's always something good. There's always something good that has happened. And I think it's a great positive start to the lesson to do that. So moving on to the classroom environment, I said we're talking about a language-rich classroom environment. So those activities we talked about a moment ago are really part of the lesson. And now what we're looking at is the classroom. Now, as I said, our classroom environment has changed, but we can still replicate many of these things. And the idea here is to maximize the language, written and oral, but in this context, it tends to be written, that's around your classroom. So, for example, in my classroom at school, I have a number of these things. Anchor posters are those posters which you often get with, for example, many of the Macmillan course books have those posters available where you have maybe a language structure or something for students to refer to, which is great. Labeling things around the room. You can put up idioms, quotes, charts, students' work, any of the things which are around your classroom. I think we often find, particularly in my situation in the Language Academy, where we've got so many different age groups, it's interesting that the adult students come in at the end of the day and they're often fascinated by the students' work which is up, which has been done by some of the younger kids, some of the teenagers, and also by other adult groups. And I think it's a great reference, it's a great chance for them to interact with something which is not part of their course, it's not part of their lesson, but it's there and it's interesting and it's more exposure. We also have newspapers around the room, etc., for people to look at. Now, again, we're talking about how to try to replicate this. So in my online classes, we use a platform where we can upload a presentation, which is basically what we're going to work on through the lesson. And I always start with a front page. And I make sure I open the class 10 minutes before, and I put this page up. The students are connecting. And so, for example, this is an example from a teenage class a couple of weeks ago. I'm reminding them of the things that they need to do to be ready for the lesson, but also the weather was terrible. The weather in Malaga has been unusually bad the last few weeks. And so I put up one of those idioms which I tend to never teach, but it's a fun thing for students to look at. It's interesting. And I said, it's raining cats and dogs today. And so before the lesson, I could hear them. These are kids who are 11, 12 years old, and they were talking about it together. And I think it's a great opportunity using those presentations in your online class to add more language in. There's no reason why we can't use that to replicate the classroom walls that we normally have. This is an example of of a handmade anchor poster, which I used to talk about. These were for kids who were like 8 or 9 years old, and we were trying to talk about what they had done at the weekend and what they were going to do the following weekend, and to get their head around that language. And so we used this to help them be able to form the correct questions and answers to talk to each other. And again, I think when students are working at home, there's no reason why we can't get them to make these posters themselves, to make these things, or you can send things through for people to look at, for people to have. Depending on their context, you may well have children who want to put up an English poster or two around their bedroom. Many adults are working from a home study. And so again, they can put those things up themselves to make their classroom more language rich. So this is another question for you of how could you make your classroom more language rich? And we're talking again about your real life classroom, shall we say, your face-to-face classroom, but also your online classroom. How could you make it more language rich? What could you add to it?
Okay, so again, we'll give you a couple of seconds to reply to that. Bearing in mind the current situation that we're working from home, teaching from home, many people are doing online classes, but also from the point of view of a face-to-face class when we go back into the classroom. So we've got some answers now. Oh, thank you. Somebody says, Fiona, I loved your idea of the graphic with the idiom. So that went down well. So a couple of answers: posters on the wall, making more anchor posters, Lucy says. Again, posters seem to be very popular because obviously they're visually very powerful and a wonderful reference. For example, the posters that have typical ones, classroom language, etc., useful classroom language, are a wonderful reference for students in the class. Another person saying, in the online class, I do what you do. I open the class early and have a slide up with stuff like mute on camera. So instructions about how to, let's say, online etiquette and some vocabulary from the last class. Yeah, very good. Another person is saying using expressions used in songs and films. Another person brings in realia. And so, yes, so a lot of ideas there. Thank you all.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks for those ideas. There's lots of variety there, and I think it's just as I said. I don't want to create work for anybody. I don't want to create extra work for my students, for you guys, for anyone. But it's a case of thinking about things that we often do, and maybe a few minutes spent making a slide or making a poster like that. You can use it time and again. It gives them access to something different. And I think it's a useful tool. Okay, last poll before we carry on to the last part. How much time do your students spend on English outside of class time? Now, this is a difficult question because I'm sure it varies, but just to get an idea, how many hours per week do you think your students are spending outside of class time on their English at the moment?
Okay, so again, we'll give you some time to respond to that. And the options are 5 or more hours, 3 or 4 hours, 1 or 2 hours, or no more time whatsoever. Of course, Fiona, when we talk about work, spending time on English outside of the class, it doesn't have to be necessarily formal, I don't know, exercises that are being set in the online classes. They could also be watching, I don't know, listening to songs on YouTube or watching programs or with subtitles in English. There could be different scenarios, no?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's key, particularly at the moment. There are so many opportunities for people to engage with English outside the classroom. And the last thing we're going to look at in a moment is how to help them with that.
Yes. Okay, so we've got answers more or less. The majority of people are saying that their students spend 1 or 2 hours on English outside of class time. And after that, we've got 3 or 4 hours, about 17% do that. And 7% are saying no more time. And 5% do 5 or more hours. Okay, so the majority are saying 1 or 2 hours outside of class time. Thank you.
Exactly, exactly. So I think just to look at the last part here, we want to maximize those opportunities. Now, whether our students are spending an hour or two, whether they're spending 5 minutes, whether they're spending 5 hours a day because they've nothing else to do, then we want to make sure that, again, they're not feeling overwhelmed with that they've got some guidance and some assistance to help them use that time appropriately. Now, these are just a few ideas of things I've been doing with my students recently. The first one is the idea of social media. Everybody is on social media all the time now because we can't go out, we can't meet up with our friends. So, of course, we're spending a lot more time than usual on the phone, on the computer. And I think one of the great things for students to do, particularly maybe lower level teenage or adult students, is to use 1 or 2 of those platforms in English. Why not? If you're learning something new, why not learn it in English? So if you're using an online platform, encourage them to put it into English, and that's language that then they can be using, they can be learning to use their online classroom in English, and it gives them some new vocabulary and new language to work with. Another idea that I've been thinking about a lot recently and done with a couple of groups is the idea of narrow reading. Now, one of the biggest things that we notice with our students at school is that they need to do more reading. Students don't seem to read enough nowadays, particularly in English, but in general. And so the idea of narrow reading is that a student is given or chooses a particular topic to read about. And so for a period of maybe a month or a term, they're reading from different sources and maybe listening to podcasts, maybe watching videos. It doesn't need to be reading, but that they're getting input on one topic. And in fact, that's a great way for them to then reinforce some of the vocabulary about the topic, to really get to grips with one area in English. And I think it's a really good one for your adult students who maybe feel that they've got too much to deal with. And we say, okay, this month you're going to read about the environment, you're going to read about technology, whatever it is, or ideally they would choose. And even with the younger children, say, look for things about animals, look for things about food, encourage them to have a focus there on what they're doing. And I think also we spend so much time at the moment listening to news about the same topic that it's great to have something else to go and look for and to focus on. And that, of course, is largely accessing authentic material. You can turn that into some kind of a project where they are working towards a presentation or something that they're going to do with the language, or it can simply be enjoying the input and enjoying the exposure. And then an interactive homework task, as Louise mentioned, people can be listening to music, they can be watching films, etc. And more I'm encouraging, particularly my teenagers, also my adults, to choose what they do for homework. And I'm not giving them exercises of grammar and vocabulary, but I'm saying you have to go away, you have to do something in English and come back and tell me what it was. And it's amazing the things that people are actually spending the time on and actually doing. It's so useful. They're watching series in English, listening to songs, and so on. One final idea here. If we're trying to motivate children to read or adults to read, one task that we did in the language school before doors closed, of course, we had 2 groups of the same age, and they took. We have a school library with some graded readers, so they took a reader each. They took it home, they read it, and they did a very short review. Now you can see it's a fairly basic review. These kids were 7 or 8 years old. But what they then did was they took the book, they wrapped it up and stuck the review on the front, and then they swapped with another class. So the other class chose their books based on the other students' reviews. And again, this is something that I think we could be doing online. There's no reason why. There's plenty of material available online to do readers and so on, and there's no reason why they can't be sharing their reviews and doing it that way. Okay, so finally, I've got a question here, which is often I talk, if you've seen me talking before, I often use this same way to talk about ideas at the end of a session, because I really like it. I got it a few years ago from Jeremy Harmer, in fact. And the idea is, what's in your suitcase? So from my session today, you might have some activities or ideas that you're going to take away and use soon, which you will put in your suitcase. You might have some ideas and activities that you are going to hang on to but not use immediately, and you can put them in the fridge. And if you've got some ideas and activities that you really didn't like and they're not useful for you, you're going to put them in the bin. So my question to you now, if you want to write in your answers, is what's in your suitcase? What activities or ideas have you got from today's session that you felt are useful and that you can put into practice quickly?
Okay. So we'll give you a couple of seconds to reply to that, and short answers are fine. I really liked your idea. Actually, the one I would put in my suitcase is the review activity, because as you say, it can be adapted to face-to-face classes or online classes, but it's a really nice idea. And the idea of putting the review on the book cover and then swapping and sharing, so much language is generated, but also a real love of reading, which, as you say, is key, I think, to language development, no matter what language you're learning, including your own language. Somebody agrees with me. They love the book review. I also like the idea of the narrow reading, as you mentioned. I think that's actually, because it gives an element, because you're so interested in personalization and motivating students, it allows them as well, doesn't it, to focus on topics that perhaps are of interest to them. So giving an element of choice is important. Okay, so let's see some of the answers we've got in. For the suitcase, Lucy says, choose your own homework. Yes, and come back and tell the class what you did. I think that's a lovely idea as well, and particularly appropriate for the situation at the moment. In the fridge, put up a photo, a meme, idiom at the beginning of the class for students to discuss as they trickle in. Yes. Somebody else agrees that they like the narrow reading, that it's a very good way to make them feel responsible and study freely. Another person says the activities for the fast finishers, that they are very important. The students have to take advantage of every minute in the class. Yes, absolutely. And there's tremendous choice there as well. Having those boxes or those plastic containers with different types of activities for students to do means that we reach all the learners, don't we, in the classroom. Grecia, thank you, Grecia Alvarez says, I would put the book reviews in my suitcase. Can't wait to try it. Okay, well, do try it soon, Grecia. Thank you. Okay.
Excellent.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Excellent, thank you. So, I mean, that's brought us to the end of our session this morning, but I think we've got a minute or two for questions, do we, Louise?
Yes, we do. We have a couple of minutes for questions. So, if you would like to send in any comments on the session or any questions you have regarding an activity, please do so now. You've got the option of sending your question. So in the meantime, while we wait for any, Claudia. Yes, Claudia. Thank you, Claudia. She sent in a question. which tech resources are you using during this webinar? Could they possibly be appropriate for online classes? Well, it's a webcasting system that we use. It's, to be honest with you, Fiona mentioned a couple, Google Hangouts, there's also Zoom, and there are various ones. They're all pretty similar, really. The important thing is that you have a good connection, obviously, and the students as well. But the facilities on these platforms are similar. You can share presentations, etc. Valerie, can we use Slido in the online class, or how did you do it? I think that's a different, it depends on the platform that you use. So you would need to look at your platform. Somebody else says, thanks, very practical session, got a few ideas I'd like to try, so that's good. And another person is saying thank you as well. Oh, and just one person has a question regarding the narrow reading, Fiona. Could you just explain it a little bit more?
Sure. So the idea is that rather than saying, as I said, I might say to my class, okay, go off and do whatever you want for homework, that each student, now you can choose the same topic for a whole group. You can choose the topic for your students, or I'm a great believer in learner autonomy. I would prefer that they choose. So, for example, in my class, each student chooses a topic, and for a particular time period, they look for, you can help them, you can guide them where to look depending on their level, depending on their age. They look for things to read, things to listen to, and things to watch in English within a particular topic. So if your topic's the environment, you might be reading newspaper articles, you might watch a documentary, you might listen to a podcast. And the idea is that because you're focusing on the same topic for a certain period of time, inevitably the same vocabulary, the same concepts, the same language does come up a few times and is reinforced in that way.
Yes, great. Okay, and another person is asking about any ideas for 6-year-olds writing online.
Oh, now that's a difficult question.
That's a difficult question because they're also just only beginning to develop their writing skills. Yeah.
Exactly. I was going to say it's difficult for many 6-year-olds to do writing at all.
I think so.
I think that very much depends on your context, if you're using an online classroom or if you're using a Moodle. But again, depending on your situation, in our school, we are encouraging our students are still using their books at home. So, we're referring to those, they're still doing the homework and so on. And we're encouraging them to write short things. The parents are having to help much more because inevitably the parents are involved in those young learner classes. But we're asking them to write sentences or short paragraphs, and simply with a photograph, they can send to our secretary, and we're having a look at the things they're doing, displaying them then in the online classroom for other students to see, and of course giving them positive feedback on their efforts of what they're doing. But I really think that depends on the platform you're using in your context. I think thinking outside of the box is the key here.
Yes, I think so. And one person is asking, referring to the platforms being used, somebody is asking what platform you use in your school, Fiona.
Okay, well, we're actually using a platform which is called Big Blue Button, but we have it integrated into our student access. So if you're an early student, then you have your own page, if you like, where you go usually to access your evaluations, your payments, etc. And we've integrated it in there so the students access the class through that, and it's safe and secure. We're lucky in that situation, but I think many people, as Louise said, many people are using very successfully. They're using Skype, Zoom, Google Hangouts, Google Classroom. There's all sorts of things available, and I think with young learners particularly, of course, we need to be aware of safeguarding. I think that's super important. But, just I think it depends on your students and your situation, what's available.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Fiona, for a very interesting talk. Well, you had lots of ideas, and I think a lot of people have sort of, I think what you've done is you've given them options for the situation now and also for when we go back into the classroom. And they're quite easy to set up, these activities. It doesn't take a lot more preparation necessarily. And your fundamental point about trying to, when we say, can I have some more, please, is challenge, isn't it? But not necessarily overwhelm or make them feel frazzled, as
Yeah,
we saw
yeah,
at the beginning, when we asked how people were feeling, but actually challenge with the kinds of activities that we set our
yeah.
students.
I
So
think
thank you
more.
very, very much. It's been a real
Thank you, Louise.
pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.